Once Upon a Time in America is a gangster epic about friendship, love, betrayal, and regret. The film was directed by Sergio Leone, the man behind the very best of the spaghetti westerns that totally subverted the western genre at the time and have since become classics. After The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Leone stated that he had retired from making westerns as he had said all he wanted to say. That is until he made Once Upon a Time in the West 3 years after that, which has also become a classic and is, of course, extremely good in its own right. He made one last western after this called Duck You Sucker, which I personally have not seen but would like to one of these days. A decade later, he made Once Upon a Time in America, a film that at first glance has little in common with the other films. This one totally abandons the western setting in the 1860s to 1880s that put Sergio Leone on the map and cemented his legacy as one of the greatest visual storytellers of all time. This film isn't as talked about as I think it should be, and I would go as far as to say this is Sergio Leone's best film. At roughly 4 hours long, Leone's epic, loosely based on The Hoods, tells a tale of David Aronson, known on the streets as Noodles, on his rise through the criminal underworld and the Jewish mafia between 1920 to the early 1930s. You may be asking, but what about the scenes of him as an old man? We'll talk about that later. The film doesn't solely focus on him though. It also depicts the lives of Max, played by James Woods in his best performance in my opinion, Patsy, played by James Hayden and unfortunately his only role before passing away of a drug overdose, and Cockeye, played by William Forsythe. Patsy and Cockeye aren't given as much screen time as Noodles and Max, as the film is largely about how their childhoods and loss of innocence in their own lives influenced themselves and their friendship as adults. Leone originally had 10 hours of footage to work with after a grueling 8-month shoot. For reference, the standard time to shoot a film is between 2 to 4 months. He filmed every scene with Robert De Niro in chronological order. The goal of this was to make Robert De Niro look very tired and exhausted by the end, when Noodles is shown to be in his 60s. It was trimmed down to roughly 6 hours with the intention of releasing 2 3-hour films. The studio didn't want that, so they forced him to cut it down further. He trimmed it down to 4 hours and 29 minutes, but was convinced by distributors to further shorten it to 3 hours and 49 minutes, which is what we see most commonly today. However, this was only the European version. The American version, on the other hand, was utterly butchered by producers. Another hour and a half was cut from the film, and all scenes were arranged in chronological order. This rendered the film a hollow and incomprehensible mess, and was a commercial and critical disaster in the States. After this, it was largely forgotten for many, many years. In 2011, however, the film was restored with around 20 minutes of extra footage and has since become much more popular. Now, finally, onto the film itself. Spoilers ahead, if you haven't seen this masterpiece. Leone still manages to incorporate his style into much of this film despite it not being a western. The film opens up with a sequence that subverts our expectations, something he did with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, as well as Once Upon a Time in the West. We see a woman being murdered by 2 men that are looking for what we learn to be the main protagonist of the film, Noodles. We learn that his real name is David Aronson. Later we meet Noodles as he is on the run. He sees 3 dead bodies after a robbery gone wrong. He stares long and hard at the bodies, with a look of guilt and regret on his face. We learn that these were his childhood friends that he grew up with and informed the police on. This feeling of regret and guilt is absolutely crucial to understanding the themes of Once Upon a Time in America. Shortly after, he kills the mob assassins after him and goes to a theater where he hides in a hidden opium den and gets high. We follow Noodles until he leaves New York, and it abruptly cuts to him returning as a much older and tired-looking man. He returns to many significant places from his childhood and begins reflecting on his past experiences. It is here when the film cuts back to 1920. Noodles is a teenager, spying on the love of his life, Deborah, played by Jennifer Connelly in her first role. The entire point of this childhood sequence is to convey another major theme of the film, loss of innocence. It is given a major portion of the overall runtime to show them being mostly semi-normal kids. They have their own troubles with girls, discovering their sexual desires, and they meet new friends. At the same time, though, their lives are very unlike ours. Cold, distant, and largely hollow. Deborah powerfully says,
"He's altogether lovable, but he'll always be a 2-bit punk, so he'll never be my beloved. What a shame."
The gang continues to grow in scale of operation despite it remaining with the main 4 guys. They blackmail police captains, do favors for the mob, while having moments of genuine brotherly friendship, and get beaten up rather brutally by the neighborhood kingpin named Bugsy and his gang. All seems to be on an upward trend until one day, Bugsy decides he has had enough with Noodles and his gang. He goes to kill all of them, and he manages to mortally wound Dominic, the youngest of the three. One of the few innocent things of Noodles' life has just been snatched away. All of his rage erupts when he stabs Bugsy to death. Two policemen show up, and Noodles turns around and stabs one of them without realizing who he was attacking. It is at this moment where he has officially lost whatever was left of his innocence. Max seemingly loses his in the following scene when he sees Noodles being taken away. This loss of innocence would drastically skew both of their senses of morality. Noodles' sexuality would never develop in a healthy way, which would ruin his relationship with Deborah later on, and Max does not value his own life whatsoever after this point. The next major portion of this movie is dedicated to Noodles reuniting with his gang. Max picks him up from prison over a decade later, and they run a couple errands before returning to the speakeasy. Here, Noodles learns that they have thrived in his absence. From here, the film becomes pretty much a straight-up gangster film as it portrays their rise through the ranks of the Jewish mob during the height of the Prohibition. They kill in a very cold manner and drive off laughing about it as if it never happened. My favorite director of all time, Quentin Tarantino, once stated that he believes that these were perhaps the most vicious gangsters ever portrayed in film. While all of this is going on, though, he tries to pursue and mend his relationship with Deborah. He buys out a restaurant that overlooks the beach, and he tells her that the only thing that got him through all that time inside was the thought of her. Almost immediately after, she springs it on him that she is going to move to Los Angeles to pursue being an actress, as she kept up with her dancing from all those years ago. Noodles goes cold at this moment and is noticeably distant emotionally. This isn't conveyed through much of any dialogue. It really is fantastic acting on Robert De Niro's part. Deborah starts to kiss Noodles, which he reciprocates at first, but then rapes her. There is never a justification for rape, but as a character, his actions could be viewed as a result of troubled sexual development. I personally do not interpret it this way. I interpret Noodles' actions here as a way to make Deborah never want to see him again. This scene is very important to understanding the major theme of the film, and that is the power of regret, and how it influences our memories and our visions of what we want our futures to look like. Noodles decides that he is pretty disgusted with this life that he has led and wants nothing to do with it. Later, when the Prohibition is coming to an end, Max suggests to Noodles that they rob the Federal Reserve. Noodles dismisses this and calls Max crazy, which severely angers him. Tensions continue to arise for a while throughout the film until a crucial scene in the car. Carol, Max's girlfriend, urges Noodles to inform the police out of concern for Max and Noodles' lives. Carol also tells him that Max would rather die than go to prison as he did not want to end up like his father. I believe that Noodles has been thinking about informing the police of their activity ever since he started doubting this gangster life that he has led for the vast majority of his life. Later, on the nights leading up to the robbery, Prohibition pretty much comes to an end, which effectively puts Max and the gang out of business. They hold a final party at the speakeasy in which Max toasts this time of his life and all of his friends, and it is shortly after this that Noodles goes into the back room of the speakeasy and informs the police anonymously. His hopes are that his friends will get arrested and not killed, because he values their lives more than they value their own lives. The robbery commences and Max, Patsy, and Cockeye are all killed after Max opens fire to ensure that he would die. We don't see this event happen because Noodles never saw it happen. It only gets confirmed to him after he sees their bodies lying on the street, which we saw earlier in the film. Since he is now technically a rat, he must go into hiding. It is in this that he goes to the opium den that we saw in one of the earliest scenes of the film. In between some of the scenes that take place in the 30s, we see old Noodles going through some of the motions of his life. He receives a letter telling him that the cemetery that his friends are buried in has been sold. Upon seeing this, he visits their graves, and without any words being spoken, we understand Noodles' guilt. Again, through all of the brilliantly understated and low-key performance by Robert De Niro. These scenes where he is silently gazing at things have significant meaning to the story. He also receives an invitation from a mysterious Secretary Bailey, indicating that his identity has been deduced by someone. He contemplates going to this party that he was just invited to and asks an older Deborah. We learn from Deborah that Bailey has a son named David, portrayed by Rusty Jacobs, who played young Max in the childhood portion. In another scene shortly thereafter, Deborah and Noodles talk about their lives, and she ultimately forgives him for what he did. Then, he meets Bailey, and we see that this mysterious Bailey is in fact Max. Bailey tells Noodles that he is going to be killed before he can testify on his behalf in an investigation on him. He says that he can't accept being killed by anyone else. As Noodles looks at the gun, a montage of scenes from the childhood portion are played. Rather than dwell on what their relationship became, he remembers the good times they had together before politely refusing. Bailey says he has nothing left to lose and simply says, "Do it." Noodles looks at him sadly and tells him a story.
Many years ago, I had a friend, a dear friend. I turned him in to save his life, but he was killed. But he wanted it that way.
Before wishing him good luck on the investigation and then leaving. Billy looks at the door and looks down at the pocket watch from all those decades ago. There is one more scene after this, but it doesn't really have much significance in my opinion. I'll explain why very shortly. The last scene of the film takes place in the same opium den from way earlier in the film. Noodles gets high on the opium and then lays back and looks up and grins widely. You may be taken off guard by this scene due to not fully understanding its significance at first. I know I did. My interpretation of this scene, and this seems to be how it is intended to be interpreted by Sergio Leone, very much changes the context of these scenes and really cements how regretful and guilty this character of David Aronson is going to be for the rest of his life. All of the scenes of Noodles as an old man are an opium-induced dream, which is one of the most common experiences of being high on opium, to have vivid and lifelike dreams that seem like they are real. This is particularly heartbreaking because he imagines a future where he is the victim, a future where his best friends are still alive, and the love of his life, Deborah, forgives him and is together with Bailey, who we now know is just a projection of Max. In this future, Noodles is a sullen and tired-looking man. Again, Sergio Leone purposely had all of these scenes filmed in chronological order to make Robert De Niro look tired, as if he was an old man who had been carrying his emotional baggage for decades. I personally have a pretty dark vision for the direction of Noodles. I don't see him killing himself, as it doesn't seem like it would be within his character, seeing as how much of his journey was about him coming to appreciate the value of human life. But I see him carrying this weight of the regret for the rest of his life. I think out of all the terrible things he and his friends did throughout their lives, the thing he regrets the most is destroying his relationship with Deborah, the only woman he has ever loved, and never will truly love. This is because Deborah's theme plays during the final shot of the film, of him getting high and grinning at the camera. He takes one puff, and is transported back to a time in his life when everyone and everything he held dear was still alive, cementing how the power of regret will forever haunt him.